Years ago, I won't name the year, I was a teaching assistant, sitting in the front row of a huge lecture class taught by my late, great, magnificent mentor, Dick Sewell, at the University of Wisconsin. And it was the day after Ronald Reagan was elected. I gave the date away. And Dick had serious politics, but he kept it close to the vest. But he got up that day and he said, "The sun came up today." And the students didn't react. He tried again. "The sun came up today," and they kind of moaned. And then he went on with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or whatever he was talking about. Before I mention a few thoughts out of Sinclair Lewis, which some of you have started reading, you've told me, the rest of you should. If you haven't bought it yet, it's probably selling well. I hope so. Herman Melville wrote a lot of poems around 1865, end of the war, into 66. I've quoted one or so before. I never do this, but I forgot my little book of Melville poems, but sure enough, there's always your phone. He called this poem The Martyr, and it has a famous line in it. It does represent the passions, the pain, the horror of the end of the Civil War, and then suddenly Abraham Lincoln's assassination. To Melville, it went like this, and it's a kind of statement about the Reconstruction to come. Good Friday was the day of the prodigy and crime, when they killed him in his pity, when they killed him in his prime. Of clemency and calm, when with yearning he was filled to redeem the evil-willed. And though conqueror, be kind. I'm sorry, I lost the screen. But they killed him in his kindness, in their madness and their blindness, and they killed him from behind. There is sobbing of the strong and a pall upon the land, but the people in their weeping can bear an iron hand. He lieth in his blood, the Father in his face. They have killed him, a forgiver, the avenger takes his place. The avenger, wisely stern, who in righteousness shall do what heavens call him to. And the parricides remand, for they killed him in his kindness and their madness and their blindness, and his blood is on their hand. There is sobbing of the strong and a pall upon the land, but the people in their weeping can bear an iron hand. Beware the people weeping when they bear an iron hand. You know, poetry is poetry, but where would we be without it? It's like humor, or music, or prayer. Spare the poets, the Irish clans, or is it the Scottish clans? Well, both used to say when they went into battle, don't kill the poets, because they have to tell the story. Sinclair Lewis was a poet. He can be lumpy at times. He keeps writing back upon himself in this book, but I had no idea what would happen this fall when I decided to name this course after a variation of Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. I had no idea what was going to happen in this election, but oh my God, now you got to read it in the wake of It Happened Here. A couple little moments in the book are worth pointing to now. We'll point to many others. And you students, you'll be reading this I guess it's over Thanksgiving break for the final week in the course. You might want to start glancing. I know you got a paper due Monday, but you might want to start reading through it. It's not short, but a must read now, and get it, because, you know, after Trump's first election, can't happen here, and 1984 sold like crazy. But Doremus Jessup, who is our protagonist in the book and the journalist up in Vermont, Fort Beulah, Vermont. You have to figure out why he places this in Vermont. Anybody from Vermont? Oh, man, no? It's just up the road, man. Doremus is this lifetime journalist. He's an idealist. He's a liberal of some sort in the 1930s. He believes in principles of fact and truth and justice and rule of law and all those good things, and he's watching them die. And he's watching this candidate that he cannot get his head around. His name is Buzz Windrip. Buzz had another first name, but Buzz Windrip. He's kind of short. He's not very attractive. He's boisterous. He lies all the time. And at one point, this is before he's elected, Doremus says of him, the senator was, he says he cannot explain. How many of us have said this recently? He cannot explain the bewitching power he has over large audiences. Quote, the senator was vulgar, almost illiterate, a public liar easily detected, and in his ideas, almost idiotic. While his celebrated piety was that of a traveling salesman for church furniture. The book is funny. I mean, great satire is funny. It's always usually over the top, too, isn't it? And it's painful. And then he finishes, and his yet more celebrated humor, the sly cynicism of the country store. So he can't quite, his job as a journalist is to explain these things. He just can't seem to do it. And it really worries him. But then, of course, Buzz gets elected. He's pure propaganda. Buzz says anything, says everything to whatever audience. Oh, and he holds a big rally at Madison Square Garden. Lewis wrote that before the famous Nazi rally actually happened in Madison Square Garden. Maybe that's where they got the idea. He says, finally, as Windrip is elected, he says, it was Buzz's masterstroke that as warmly as he advocated everyone's getting rich by just voting to be rich, he denounced all fascism and Nazism so that most of the Republicans who were afraid of democratic fascism and all the Democrats who were afraid of Republican fascism were ready to vote for him. Well, remember our recent election, they were both for democracy, just like everybody was for liberty in the American Civil War. Then there's this passage. Well, the election's over. Buzz Windrip has been elected. Poor Doremus, again, is just beside himself. He's wondering whether to just give in to this. Just give in. So what does he do? He says, quote, all right, hell with this country, if it's like that. Hell with them, you know. F you, country. All these years I've worked, and I never did want to be on all these committees and boards and charity drives. And don't they look silly now? Anybody thinking in those terms? What I always wanted to do was to sneak off to an ivory tower or anyway, celluloid imitation ivory, and read everything. I've been too busy to read. And he goes into this long riff about all the books he wants to take time and read now. Does that sound familiar to anybody? That's my everyday thought. If I have to read for a living, I read all the time. I read all day, all night, but I just don't get to read what I really want to. He starts listing all the books he wants to read. He's going to find somewhere to escape. He's going to go read. And some Americans right now are planning to go backpacking. They're going to, they're going to have backyard gatherings. They're going to just go escape. Is escape an option? Probably has to be to some extent. I'm not here to say whether escape's an option. I ran into 5 of you walking in here saying, can't wait to hear what you're going to say, like I'm going to give you some wisdom to understand all this election. No, not really. But I am going to help explain how the Civil War ended and what Reconstruction was about to become. But before I do, there's another poet worth hearing here. I know I quote poets a lot, but Whitman's making another comeback here today. Where is he? He's back here somewhere. There he is. I put him next, this is profane, but I put him next to Andrew Johnson, just for the sake of contrast. You know, Whitman wrote many great poems. I think his greatest in terms of pure art. And I'm not a poetry scholar, I just use them. Is Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. It's a long poem. It's a gorgeous poem. You have to stay with it. It's his paean to Lincoln at his death. It's his imagination of the Lincoln funeral train crossing the country in April 1865. 20-some days it took. Whitman wasn't with the train, but he imagines it. And When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed is a poet trying to give to grief his and the nation's a mood, a setting, an explanation. The mood is at first calming, depoliticized. It's not partisan. It's a contemplation of what Whitman calls the fathomless, sure and winding arms of cool enfolding death. Whitman was our death poet. He never quite stopped writing about death in the Civil War. He imagines a warbling, a little bird. As the funeral train is going by, he imagines a little bird, a warbling he calls it, in a secluded little swamp, singing what he calls a solitary song of the bleeding throat, quoting Whitman, death's outlet song of life. For well, dear brother, I know, if thou wast not granted to sing, thou wouldst surely die. It's like Whitman is identifying with that songbird. You can sing. Thank God. The poet then speaks for millions, perhaps still does, maybe, in 1865 and beyond, who were wondering how to remember and forget this ghastly war they've just experienced. They don't know how to forget yet. They don't know how to remember yet. They sure as hell don't know how to forgive yet. How shall I warble myself, says Whitman, for the dead one there I loved. As an offering, Whitman picks a sprig of lilac. It's April in the Midwest. He picks a sprig of lilac and places Abraham Lincoln's funeral train in the setting of, quote, ever-returning spring across the vast landscape. Over the breast of spring, the land amid cities, amid lanes, and through old woods where lately the violets peeped from the ground, spotting the gray debris. Spring. Amid the grass in the fields, each side of the lanes, passing the endless grass, passing the yellow-speared wheat, every grain from its shroud in the dark brown fields, uprisen. Passing the apple tree blows of white and pink in the orchards. Why can't we have elections in April? Carrying a corpse to where it shall rest in the grave night and day, journeys a coffin. The bird sings its, Whitman's words, carol of death. And the poet tries to give words to the music. It's as though Whitman is trying to embody that little bird. Yet one senses that even Whitman could not match that warbling's power to deliver what he calls that powerful psalm in the night, to capture the meaning of the death caused by the war, all the death caused by the war. He is left with visions of battle corpses in his mind, debris of all the slain soldiers of the war, quote unquote. And then he says, the living remained and suffered. Whitman leaves the sprig of lilac in a dooryard and just tries to take hope from spring. All right, before the end of today, go read Lilacs in the Dooryard Bloom. I don't know if it'll help you, but it'll concentrate you. For what that's worth. Let's back up here. Yeah, all right. I just put this in because it's an incredible Civil War photo. Those are 3 Confederate prisoners actually at Gettysburg in '63. Pretty hard-looking characters. Good that they got captured, I think. You know who this is. It's William Tecumseh Sherman. I wish I had time to go into the entire background of William Tecumseh Sherman. I don't, but I will do this. He was an extraordinary American military officer. He was racist to the bone. He didn't want any black troops around his army. He's going to have thousands of black people around his army once he gets into Georgia, especially after the fall of Atlanta. But as a battlefield commander, as a ferocious strategist, the war didn't produce anyone else quite like him except Grant. He and Grant developed together with Phil Sheridan and with Lincoln himself, and they had they had 2 or 3 actual meetings, the 4 of them. Once Lincoln had brought Grant to the east and put Sherman in charge and command in Tennessee and Georgia, and Phil Sheridan, in command in the Shenandoah Valley, he finally had 3 generals who were willing to fight offensive, all-out war against especially the Confederate armies, but also against the resources of the South. And that's what made this war so totalizing, so horrible, so devastating. The aim was to defeat and destroy Confederate armies, but they were now going to do whatever it took to do that. We will never know how many civilians died in this process. Arguably, one of the 2 or 3 greatest turning points in the war was the fall of Atlanta. Now, the other day, I waxed on about the election of 1864, and perhaps I forgot to mention that what really got Lincoln elected was the fall of Atlanta. In the first 2-3 days of September 1864, Atlanta had been under siege most of the summer, or for a couple of months. This city in the heartland of the South, it's one huge, big railroad center. When the news came of the fall of Atlanta, It was news like no other in the war, especially across the North, where the war weariness over these casualty lists was so terrible. The Union Army got Lincoln reelected. And then in Mobile Bay on August 25th, about a week, just about exactly a week before the fall of Atlanta, Admiral Farragut took Mobile Bay. Jammed the torpedoes, full speed ahead, famously. Strapped himself to the mast of his ship. I mean, you know, this stuff is out of romance, but it actually happened. He lost numerous ships. Over 200 Union sailors died in that battle, and their bones are at the bottom of Mobile Bay, but they took Mobile Bay. And I told you about Wallace Turnage, that escaped slave who's heading down the west side of Mobile Bay through the Fall River estuary, snakes and alligators and everything else, and he heard this incredible battle, this noise out in the bay. He didn't know what it was. He was hearing the Battle of Mobile Bay, largest naval engagement of this, in American history till that time. And then Philip Sheridan's army began to move down the Shenandoah, especially in the wake of the fall of Atlanta. And voters in the North were affected. If inflation drove this election in some way or not, what so many Northern voters were looking at is, are we actually ever going to win this war? Is it possible to win this war? Because if not, McClellan and those Democrats are going to bring us peace. And not another of my sons is going to, bleed to death on some terrible field in Georgia or Virginia. But now what was to happen? Well, Sherman took Atlanta. He decided he didn't have to do this. He could have, sat down like an old McClellan would have and just sort of occupied Atlanta and see what the Confederacy did next. No, he engaged in one of the most amazing military feats of this war. It was brutal. It was terrible. It was devastating. It was a march of 285 miles from Atlanta to Savannah. When they got to Liberty County, right at the coast, which is south of Savannah, they turned left. And to this day, if you go to the local historic sites in Liberty County, they will tell you, this is where Sherman turned left. And you realize, oh yeah, Savannah's up there, and the ocean's there. That march became a march of physical devastation of farmlands. Yes, the liberation of slaves, although Sherman didn't want to do that. He kept giving orders to get the slaves away from my army. They would not leave. At one point, about 2/3 of the way through the march, he will even take up the pontoon boats they were using. They're not boats, they're bridges, sorry. These pontoons, they could throw these pontoon bridges down in an hour and pull them back up to get troops across a river. He pulled those pontoons up when the thousands of black people reached the river so they couldn't cross. It's a complicated, messy emancipation going on. And my student, Ben Parton, he does his PhD about 2 years ago, has written a brilliant book about to come out on Sherman's March to the Sea, and it's primarily about the black refugees following Sherman's army and how we can begin to understand where they came from, how they did what they did, how they ended up working for Sherman's army even though he didn't want it, and how they're all gonna, not all of them, some of them are gonna die in the process, but a lot of them are gonna make it all the way to Beaufort, South Carolina, north of Savannah, halfway to Charleston, where they will become part of the freed people of this experiment at Beaufort, South Carolina, where we even sometimes date the beginnings of Reconstruction. But here was Sherman's plan. He said many things about this. He's so quotable. Can't resist. We are not fighting hostile armies. We're fighting a hostile people. Make war on the people. His view was the Union armies in the South must not retreat north at all. Even if a Confederate army, and they did under General Hood, a small contingent, not that small, of Confederate infantry left Atlanta after the fall of Atlanta and tried to invade Tennessee, actually did, to distract Sherman's army, keep him there, keep him occupied so he couldn't march across Georgia. Sherman said, to hell with him. His aim and objective was the civilian population and their phones. It was no longer, his objective was no longer a Confederate army because there really wasn't one in front of him. He was only opposed by small bands of people, local militias, home guards. And he said this during the march: "We cannot change the hearts of those people of the South, but we can make war so terrible on them and make them so sick of war that generations will pass before they will ever appeal to it again." You wouldn't want to be fighting that guy. You might not even want to be fighting with him. His direct orders to his commanders were simple. Move through Georgia, smashing things as you go to the sea. Smashing things. It meant tearing up railroads. It meant burning farms after you steal all the livestock. It meant harshly treating a lot of people. Some rapes, although nearly the number, as the Lost Cause will later suggest. This was winning a war with fear, destruction, and maneuver. And the freed people swarmed to Sherman's army. The word was out. Sherman doesn't like us. But that army was an army of liberation now, whether he liked it or not. Oh, Sherman, so quotable. When he was out west along the Mississippi River before coming east, he'd already practiced this kind of warfare. There was a point at which he had burned some houses along the Mississippi River, and he gave an order, quote, "Destroy the place, but leave one house to mark it." Leave one, so they know what happened to the rest. And there was a woman who wrote to him during some of the worst of this devastation. Her name was Miss P.A. Frazier. He wrote back and he said, "Would to God ladies acted their mission on earth," you know where this is going, "that instead of inflaming the minds of their husbands and brothers to lift their hands against the government of their birth and stain them in blood, had prayed them to forbear, to exhaust all the remedies afforded by them by our glorious Constitution, and thereby avoided this horrid war you speak of." It's the Sherman saying, "Take that, lady." They reached the sea, December 20, 1864, and it took artillery warfare and some infantry charges to take Savannah, but not that much. A lot of Savannah was damaged, but not destroyed. And again, Sherman did not stand still. This would be the longest march by any military, any full army, any military units, anywhere in this war. And he began to then move north. He did not go over to Charleston. Charleston is getting bombarded like hell all through the winter of 1864-65. Oops. Come on. But he didn't go to Charleston. He headed straight north. But he did go through Columbia, the capital of South Carolina. And we'll never know exactly who started the fires in Columbia. But without Sherman's army there wouldn't have been fires. And they burned and destroyed and blew up most of Columbia, South Carolina. If you ever visit Columbia, South Carolina today, they used to be very proud of having the world's largest Confederate flag there out on a restaurant. I don't know if you get to see that anymore. But there's great libraries at the University of South Carolina, fascinating memorials on their state capitol grounds. That city was entirely rebuilt. It was in rubble in 1865. Reached there on February 17th, as the map says, and then he kept moving right on up into North Carolina. I wish I could tell you more stories about the march to the sea and beyond. Imagine, they could have had this war over if they had cell phones a lot earlier, I would suspect. But in North Carolina, Sherman was chasing a Confederate army under Joseph E. Johnston, back in the war now. He'd been badly wounded in the 7 Days battle in Virginia. And he will finally corner him, and he'll be forced to surrender in what I think is today inside the city limits of Raleigh, but it was just outside of Raleigh on April the 18th, 1865, after Appomattox. And Sherman wanted even harsher terms, and Lincoln had to reprimand him. But up in Virginia, Grant launched a massive campaign in the summer of 1864. We call it the Overland Campaign because it was all over land. It wasn't by amphibious landings anymore along the coast, a la McClellan in 62. This was Grant's army, over 100,000 men. Moving into northern Virginia, they fought terrible, horrific battles in places called the Wilderness outside of Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania Courthouse, south of Fredericksburg. At the Wilderness, where's that? No, did I not show? Well, I thought I had. At the Wilderness, which is this dense wooded area, it's still densely wooded, west of Fredericksburg, the two armies, Lee's army and Grant's army, tangled for 2 days in a dense forest. The battle was so horrific, so constant, use of cannon so constant, the forest turned on fire, and the wounded, many hundreds of them were simply burned to death. In 1961, Robert Penn Warren wrote a great novel about the Civil War, which doesn't get read much at all. People didn't want to read it in 1961 because it was all about slavery. But he calls it Wilderness. Go read it. All I'll tell you is it ends at the Wilderness. But at the end of that battle, everyone expected Grant to do what every other Union army had done in this war. They had invaded Virginia. They had faced Lee's army. They had been either stymied or defeated and retreated north. And this had been horrific. Nobody won the Battle of the Wilderness. They just slaughtered each other. Gigantic casualties. But there was one north-south road through the wilderness. And the Union troops, who were still ready for battle and on their feet, were gathered along this road on both sides for probably up to 2 miles by the night of the second day, which was May 4th. And they expected they were marching north, leaving a lot of their friends in unknown graves. And then came riding down the road Grant with a small group of staff heading south. He didn't stop to wave his sword or, let the wind hit his sash like McClellan would have. He probably didn't even tip his cap. He just kept riding south. And slowly but surely, those Union soldiers began to stand up. And they began to scream and cheer. Grant, Grant, Grant. They realized, hey, we're going south. What motivates young men in war? We're still trying to figure that out. That's why we have poets. But Grant was that kind of soldier. He was ruthless. If you've read Ron Chernow's biography, if you've read Bill McFeely's biography, there's several great biographies. There's been a recent industry of Grant biographies. It was high time. He'd been ignored for 75 years. But Grant's idea was you make war long enough on an enemy you've outnumbered and you have more resources, you will ultimately win, but you have to be prepared to send your own men to die day in and day out. And he wrote about that problem in his memoirs, the best-selling book of the 19th century. 2 volumes, written while he was dying. Throat cancer, way too many cigars. I don't have time to tell you all about North Anna and Cold Harbor. Cold Harbor was the one battle, though, and if you read Grant's memoirs, he just openly, all but wept on the page. He openly admitted a terrible mistake in ordering thousands of men to make a charge they had no chance of ever winning. And 10,000 would die or be wounded in about an hour or hour and a half. And it's that battle where the soldiers were asked to pin their names to their uniforms. They didn't have dog tags because their officers knew that most of them wouldn't come back. But you can see from this map, the strategy here was to continue south, continue south, continue south, eventually to Petersburg. He was hoping to win this war before the end of the summer. Now think back to the chronology of this. Lincoln barely gets the renomination of his own party. The campaign is in full tilt. It's that racist, brutal campaign I described the other day. The Democrats painting the Republicans as the party of emancipation and amalgamation and miscegenation. And Lincoln's really black, and on and on and on. And the Republicans are trying to dance around the emancipation question. They're trying to say, well, you know, but we're not for black equality. I mean, they're trying to get elected. And nobody knows what's going to happen. And the casualties from the Overland campaign, by the end of that summer, 65,000 Union casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. And the North by now has become an engine of men into this meat grinder. Grant keeps getting replacements and more replacements and more replacements. Most of those 65,000 were replaced. It was so bad that at Spotsylvania Courthouse, Charles Brewster's regiment, the 10th Massachusetts, who I've told you about before, was mustered out because there weren't enough left. I should have brought Charlie along today, but in his letters, he writes, and again, he goes silent in his letters for, like 6-7 days because they're in constant march. March, stop, dig. March, stop, dig. March, stop, dig. Oh, go bury some people. March, stop, dig. They're at Spotsylvania for these 5 days of constant charges and battles in trench works. And at one point, Charlie does write to his mother. Imagine being his mother, and you get this letter. I'm alive. I don't know why. I'm looking out at a trench clogged full of dead bodies, some still alive. And he says, there's a Confederate sitting on top of other dead bodies, screaming at the top of his lungs. And as usual, Charlie said, he's screaming about his bad cause. I mean, he's always partisan. Well, why not? But it's Charlie's attempt to try to, describe what he's doing and seeing, and he really can't. That poor slob is going to survive this war. They will finally surrender at Appomattox. I wish I'll save Appomattox I'll save Appomattox for a little later, because Appomattox is actually where the Lost Cause was born, and some hints toward what Reconstruction might be came about. Back in Washington, Lincoln has to be inaugurated, of course, second time. Frederick Douglass went to Washington for this inauguration. He's standing right out there to Lincoln's left. If you've ever seen the famous photograph of Lincoln delivering the second inaugural, Douglass is down about 10, 12 rows out. Barely can make him out. But he wasn't going to miss it. And Douglass had actually sort of dreamed of writing the second inaugural for Lincoln, but that Lincoln wrote that speech, and not a Frederick Douglass or some other abolitionist, made all the difference. It's short, it's tidy, it's taut, it's genius. He tries to explain the moment. March 4, 1865. The war's not quite ended yet, but it's very close. He says, 4 years ago I stood before you, and the situation was this and that. He said at that time, both parties, quote, deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. More book titles have been taken from this small address than any other piece of prose I know of. Possible, maybe the Declaration of Independence. I can go through this speech and almost every other line I can tell you there's a book title or somebody drew their book title from that line. And the war came is one of them. But Lincoln goes on, it's his explanation of the war. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves. He's not avoiding the issue here. He's not stepping around slavery here as he's trying to find unity again. Not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part. That's that homely logic of Lincoln's. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. All knew. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend that interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Yeah, Abe, but you're way beyond that now, aren't you? Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself would cease. Each looked for an easier triumph, a result less fundamental and astounding. But then he says both sides read the Bible, pray to the same God. Each invokes God's aid against the other. It may seem strange, he says, that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, says Lincoln, that we be not judged. And then he goes on and says, the Almighty has his own purposes. You can always get out of something with that one. But he doesn't get out of it. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offense come, but woe to that man whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses, which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense cometh. And then a little further down, the famous lines, fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, he says, if God wills it to continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it still must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Every drop of blood shed by the lash paid by the sword. He did not have to go there. This could have been a nice speech. This could have been a kind speech. Yes, it ends on niceness. It ends with, we always quote the ending of the speech, and I hate that. And I'm not against charity. With malice toward none, charity for all. You ever been to a historic site and they play that on the loudspeaker? And you're all supposed to feel unity. It's not a speech about unity. It's a speech that has said, we're going to do whatever it takes to end the war and end slavery. But of course he would end with this. Malice toward none, charity for all. Firmness in the right. Bind up the nation's wounds. Care for him who was born in the battle. Care for the widow. Care for the orphan. Try to achieve a lasting, cherish a just and lasting peace. Now, those who actually heard that speech and those who actually read it understood it. Okay. Now, but they've been arguing about Reconstruction for the last, almost 2 years already. Reconstruction's been going on during wartime. Whoops. Oh, I love this painting by Winslow Homer. It's the trenches at Petersburg. It's a soldier who just jumped up on the parapet and lost his mind, apparently. He just started screaming. I'll come back to Appomattox. Oops. By the way, at the end of Lincoln's speech, Frederick Douglass wasn't done for the day. He had a companion with him. They got in line out on Pennsylvania Avenue and they followed Lincoln's carriage all the way back to the White House. He didn't have an invitation for the the after party, the reception, big, huge reception. He just went up to the door and said, I'd like to come in. And they said, no, you don't have an invitation. And he said, tell the President Frederick Douglass is out here. I'd like to attend. Somebody went in, somebody came back out and said, okay. He goes in, and we have one witness for this. Thank God. Otherwise, we have to believe Douglass. Douglass said he saw Lincoln's head up above everybody in the room, east room of the White House. Lincoln saw him, because Douglass was he's 2 inches shorter than Lincoln. Lincoln comes over to him, says, Mr. Douglass, what did you think of my speech? Douglass says, no, it doesn't matter what I think. Attend to your guests. And the president said, no, I want to know what you think. And Douglass said, that was a sacred effort. I don't know if the conversation ended there, but it should have. If there's another movie made, that's where it should end. But they've been arguing and fighting now about Reconstruction for a while. Wartime Reconstruction already took hold at the end of 1863 with a suggestion of policies. You may think back with me to the outline. There you are. I'll get you started on this. Lincoln's suggestion not early in the war, by the end of 63, early 64, was a program he called, well, he didn't call it the 10% plan. We've come to call it that. But the idea was simply this. When you could find 10% of the eligible voters from 1860 in a given Confederate state, 10%, to come together, denounce secession, accept the end of slavery, although they don't have a 13th Amendment yet, and begin to form a new state government, a new free government, then Lincoln as president, as the executive, as commander-in-chief in wartime, would readmit them to the Union. Just like that, quickly. And a lot of members of his own party said, whoa, wait a minute, 10%? That means 90% don't have to participate? That means, what are you going to do next? So wherever two are gathered? Well, this is rooted in Lincoln's view of the war and his view of states' rights. He says, look, they never really left the Union, technically, he said. States are still in the Union. They just have to be reinstated to their normal position in the Union by the president as an executive in wartime. Leadership of his own party in Congress, we soon will call the radical Republicans, say, no, sir. That's just rapid restoration, not Reconstruction. Lincoln's view was, as he put it once, physically we cannot separate. They're still in the Union. Radical Republicans said, no, sir. They left the Union. And they're going to push back hard. And they're going to try to wrest control of Reconstruction away from Lincoln, their own president. And in fact, they will. Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, and others. And the radical wing of the Republican Party now is ascendant because of emancipation. They really are ascendant because the slaves are being freed. And they got a whole different constitutional theory. They say, nope, Southern states not only left the Union, they committed treason. Thaddeus Stevens called it the conquered provinces approach. They're like provinces of a foreign enemy you've conquered in war. They have to be remade, not just restored. They have to be fundamentally refashioned, and that will take time. Charles Sumner, senator from Massachusetts, said, he called same theory, but he called it state suicide. That's pretty clear. The states ceased to exist by their own acts. They became a foreign government, the Confederate States of America. We are defeating them, if we defeat them, and we can remake them. That will take time. Sumner said secession was, quote, instant forfeiture of statehood. These are very different views of the Constitution, as usual. People go to the Constitution and they find a little this and a little of that, and they apply it. And they wanted Congress to have responsibility, not the executive. It becomes now a kind of political warfare between Lincoln and his own party. That's going on too in 1864, during Sherman's March to the Sea and the Overland Campaign in Virginia and the election. All this is still going. This is all going on politically in Washington. And some of these radicals wanted to dump Lincoln from the ticket to get him out of the way of their Reconstruction ideas. They didn't succeed. They will respond with what's called the Wade-Davis Bill, named for Benjamin Wade and Henry Winter Davis. Wade was from Ohio, Davis was from Maryland, two Republicans. They issued it on the 4th of July, 1864, right in the middle of the Overland Campaign. And here was their plan, on paper. Not 10% of the Southern voters in a Southern state come together, form a new constitution, so forth, so on. A majority of the white male citizens based on the 1860 census. And of course, the first question about that was always, how are you going to find a majority in Georgia that didn't support the Confederacy? And the radicals would kind of wink and say, that's kind of the point. Second thing was they were going to require an ironclad oath. You had to swear an oath that you had never aided and abetted the Confederacy in Alabama. And thirdly, they said all officers above lieutenant and all civil officials in the Confederacy, governors and so on, state legislators, would be disfranchised, no longer citizens, ruled out of the polity, declared, quote, not a citizen of the United States. This was conquered provinces, put into law. What'd Lincoln do? He gave it a pocket veto. You know what that is? You just don't sign it. You don't say you're not going to sign it, but you don't sign it. You put it in your pocket, so to speak. He issued a proclamation on the Wade-Davis Bill. It was conciliatory. It's his own party, after all. Now, guys, he's saying. He didn't completely reject it. He said he, quote, refused to be inflexibly committed to any one plan. What does that mean? Whatever you're going to make of it. He said he was verbally willing to listen. But none of that placated the radicals in his party. Here's the key. Lincoln viewed Reconstruction, however, if and when they win the war, and that's still a big if out there. And it all depends on Northern morale to keep them fighting. And it depends on his re-election. It depends on everything. He viewed Reconstruction as just another way of winning the war. It's another measure, whatever policy you could put in place, whatever, flexible policy you could put in place that you might have to change later, fine, but it's just another way of defeating the Confederacy. But to the radical Republicans, the Stevenses, the Sumners, the Ben Wades, the John Binghams, we'll hear much more about them now in the next week or so, they saw Reconstruction, even in wartime, as a far-reaching transformation of the South, a far-reaching transformation of those Confederate states into something wholly new, based upon the emancipation of the slaves and the beginnings, at least, of some kind of black equality and the right to vote. In other words, they want a revolution that it will take time. And they want it done by legislation from Congress. And hence we see the battle lines laid between presidential and congressional Reconstruction. I'm sure the clock is saying I've run out of time, but lastly, they are going to pass that 13th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment is so simple in its language until it isn't. And it's been around since late 1863. This idea of the 13th Amendment was there throughout the 1864 election. It's one of the reasons the Democrats were so successful in painting the Republicans as the party of black freedom, the party of future black equality, because they're going to pass a 13th Amendment if you re-elect them. They're going to end slavery forever, and The next part will be black equality forever, and the black people will be voting, and they'll be running for office, and they'll be running your school and marrying your daughter. And the Republicans in the election of '64, they'd already written the 13th Amendment. They just kind of had to run away from it during the election. Yes, they wanted to have a constitutional amendment. Lincoln wanted a constitutional amendment. So did lots of other Republicans, because they didn't trust this executive order called the Emancipation Proclamation. What happens when the war is over to an executive order? That was only done by a president under war powers. So in January, they will pass this extraordinary bill or enactment. And there it is. I mean, this language is simple. The part that's always been, in modern times, debated is, of course, except for punishment for crime. Now, I have to say, I'll just say this once. There's an idea out there, and I know I've run over, and I'll shut up here in 30 seconds. There's an idea out there in our land that that language in the 13th Amendment about punishment for crime is the reason we have mass incarceration. No, it isn't. I'm sorry. Yes, 13th is a good documentary film, especially about 1/3 of the way in for the rest of it, when it deals with the 20th century and when it eventually deals with the drug laws. But that 13th Amendment has also been used in our own time. It's being used right now to stop human traffickers, to stop sex traffickers. And I am up to here with hearing people just spout this idea. If it weren't for that 13th Amendment, we wouldn't have any mass incarceration. That is bad history. Sorry, sometimes historians actually say that. It's bad history. They had to do that, or this thing wouldn't have been legal. And a whole lot of people didn't think it was legal to begin with. But emancipation was still only a matter of battlefields, contraband camps, and an executive order and the bravery of the freed people. Now you got it in the Constitution. And that second section, Section 2, will be in the other two great amendments, the 14th and the 15th. It'll be the same language. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Why have we fought about these amendments, even the 13th, but especially the 14th and the 15th, forever since? It's because we have to keep defining what's appropriate legislation. When this was passed, narrowly, not quite with the drama that Spielberg's movie gave it, with that guy running back and forth to the office, but that's all right. It was close. Frederick Douglass's son was in the balcony of the Congress, of the House, when this passed. And he wrote, Douglass wasn't there, but he wrote a note to his father. He said, "Father, I wish you were here. This is your day." Don't retreat just to your books. Go backpacking if you must. But whatever you do, don't stop believing in the things you believe in. The reasons you're here, the reasons you came to college, the reason you fought like hell to get into a place called Yale. Don't apologize for that, even though the country seems to not like us. They're not going to like us tomorrow either. Americans don't trust us. Our task is to find some way someday to make them trust us again. Thank you.